Number 12. The door that only opens once a year. On December 21, 1967, Michael J. O'Kelly stood in the dark chamber at Newgrange and waited. Outside, the Boyne Valley was still frozen in winter silence. Inside, the passage was only 19 meters long, but it felt longer. The stone walls narrowed the world to one line, one opening, one chance. Then the sun came up. It did not flood the chamber all at once. It arrived like a signal. A thin blade of light crossed the entrance roof box, slipped down the passage, and reached the inner room for just a few minutes. O'Kelly had spent years getting to that moment. He had been excavating the site since 1962, summer after summer, trying to understand what this mound had been before collapse and grass turned it into a featureless hill. What he found was not a simple burial place. It was a machine, made of stone and alignment, built around 3200 BC, about 40 kilometers north of Dublin, in the Brú-na-Bóinne landscape. The monument had been there for nearly 5,000 years before anyone saw it clearly again. For centuries, it sat under rubble and overgrowth. People passed it without knowing what they were looking at. The shape was there. The meaning was gone. Secrets survive underground by becoming ordinary. Newgrange forces you to picture the people who built it, not in abstract, but in muddy fields and cold weather, hauling stone after stone into place. The mound covers a chamber with a corbelled roof that rises about 6 meters high, and its long passage is lined with carefully placed stones, some carved with spirals and zigzags that still catch the eye today. It is a tomb, yes, but it is also far more deliberate than that. It was aimed. The entrance was designed so that a single sunrise at the winter solstice would find its way inside. That is a very specific obsession for a people without metal tools, without engines, without any of the modern machines we use to measure time. And yet, they built one anyway. They built something that did not just sit in the landscape. It worked with the sky. For a short stretch each year, the monument stops being dark stone and becomes a light trap. The chamber receives the morning sun, and the dead, or the memory of the dead, are touched by the day at the exact moment the year turns. The restoration made Newgrange famous, but it also complicated the picture. The white quartz facade people now recognize is not untouched ancient surface. It is a modern reconstruction. The curbstones are original. The inner core is original. But the finished look, the gleaming face that photographs so well, is partly archaeology's best guess about how it may once have appeared. Even the monument's modern identity is built from fragments and decisions. The ancient site did not come back perfectly. It came back interpreted. And O'Kelly did not uncover everything. By the time he stopped in 1975, he said only about 1/3 of the site had been investigated. Most of it was left in place for future methods, future answers, future hands. That restraint matters. It means Newgrange is still partly sealed, still partly waiting, still more buried than known. That is what makes the chamber so unsettling when the solstice light finally lands. You are standing inside a tomb that behaves like a calendar. You are inside a grave that opens, briefly, only for the year's turning point. You are in a place where death, season, and power were arranged into the same stone corridor. The beam is not a mystery anymore. The beam is proven. What remains hidden is the reason. Was the alignment meant to guide ritual, to honor the dead, to mark authority over the land, or to do all of that at once, in one carefully timed event that only a few people were meant to witness? The monument gives the sunrise back every December. It never gives up its full explanation. So the door stands there in County Meath, a passage cut into the earth, a chamber waiting in darkness. And for 7 seconds of sunlight, the whole place becomes a message. Then the light moves on. The chamber goes dark again. The stone stays where it is, holding its silence. Number 11. The cave that should never have been opened. A dog, 4 teenagers, and 1 sealed prehistoric gallery. Number 11 turns out to be a warning. On September 12, 1940, near Montignac in southwestern France, 4 teenagers followed a dog into the hillside and found a hole in the ground. Marcel Ravida, Jacques Marcel, Georges Agniel, Simon Kwanka. They were not looking for art. They were looking for their dog. Below them was a sealed underground gallery covered in Paleolithic paintings, sleeping there for thousands of years. The first shock was not that the cave existed, it was how alive it looked once the boys widened the opening and climbed down. Horses, deer, aurochs, ibex. UNESCO later described the site as crucial to the history of prehistoric art, and the number that keeps coming back is around 100 animal figures, painted in vivid color across the walls and ceilings. The cave did not feel empty. It felt inhabited, as if something had been left there on purpose and sealed behind darkness. People like to turn that into a myth fast. A hidden cave, ancient hands, perfect preservation, a treasure protected by darkness itself. Lascaux does not survive as a fairy tale. It survives as a warning. The paintings were preserved because the cave stayed sealed. For millennia, the underground air did the work. No crowds, no flashbulbs, no wet breath hanging in the chamber, no boots grinding dust into the floor. Then modern people arrived, and the damage began. The cave was open to visitors after the war, in 1948, and at first that must have felt like triumph. The underground secret was real, and now everyone could finally see it. Picture the narrow passages, the rush of bodies, the dark coming alive again, this time with electric light. Underground spaces are precise. They do not forgive much. Breath adds carbon dioxide. Bodies add moisture. Lamps add heat. Light brings algae. Human traffic changes the skin of the cave itself. Calcite deposits begin to form where they should not. The paintings do not need a knife to be harmed. They only need exposure, repeated again and again. The thing that made Lascaux famous started undoing it. By 1963, the original cave was permanently closed to visitors. André Malraux ordered it shut. The public was taken out. The cave was sealed again. Not because it had been faked, not because the paintings were less important than advertised, because they were too important to leave in the path of people. From there, France did something unusual. It stopped trying to make everyone stand inside the original and started making the original survive. Lascaux II reproduced about 80% of the paintings. Lascaux IV, opened in 2016, went further and made the replica experience more complete. The result is strange but logical. The cave became famous because it could not be shared without being threatened. So the solution was to share the copy and protect the source. That is the paradox at the center of Lascaux. Its global fame grew from the fact that the real thing had to be hidden again. The original underground gallery became a protected relic of itself, while the public-facing Lascaux became a family of replicas, each one trying to carry the image without carrying the damage. The wider landscape around it is full of the same idea. The Vizier Valley holds 147 prehistoric sites and 25 decorated caves. Lascaux sits inside a whole buried world of memory and image. But Lascaux is the one that changed the rules. It showed that discovery is not the end of the story. Sometimes it is the beginning of the threat. There is a hard lesson here, and it is not abstract. Not ancient time, but modern presence put the cave at risk. The paintings lasted for ages in darkness, then began to fail under the pressure of being seen. Why were they so stable for millennia and so fragile within a few years of tourism? The broad answer is clear. The exact balance of CO2, humidity, light, algae, and calcite is still a conservation problem, still being managed, still not fully settled. So when the dog led those 4 teenagers into the hill on that day in 1940, they did more than find a cave. They found proof that some underground places are not meant to be opened, like rooms in a house. They are meant to be entered once, understood partly, and then protected from the very hunger that found them. Number 10. The maze that fed an empire. This cave was mined, mapped, and monetized for centuries. Number 10 is longer than a city. Located in Mammoth Cave National Park in central Kentucky, it is not a single chamber with a clean beginning and end. It is a maze, and that is where the story starts. A living one, passage after passage, level after level. Some corridors narrow to a squeeze, others open into rooms big enough to swallow a church. Its passage network is one of the world's most extensive cave systems, and even now it is still being connected, still being measured, still refusing to become complete. Start with the numbers that made it famous. The cave has more than 412 miles surveyed. Another official count puts it at 405 miles mapped. Those are not small differences. In a cave this size, a few miles is not trivia. It is another branch, another turn, another dark stretch that someone has to crawl, rope, float, or crawl again to prove exists. The world's longest known cave is not a finished object. It is a running count. The story begins in the late 1790s with a name that sits halfway between legend and local memory: John Houchins. He entered the cave while hunting. That is where the public story likes to start. A lone man, a hidden opening, a discovery moment. But Mammoth Cave was never just discovered once. It was opened, mined, mapped, and remapped for more than 2 centuries. Each era found a different use for the same darkness. By the early 1800s, enslaved laborers were mining cave soil for saltpeter for gunpowder. That is the part people often skip, because it is less romantic than exploration. But it is the first major reason the cave mattered: not beauty, industry. During the War of 1812, the demand rose hard. Saltpeter was one of the essential ingredients in gunpowder, and Mammoth Cave became part of the war economy. Men worked underground to scrape the earth, leach it, and extract what the army needed above ground. The cave was not a wonder first. It was a warehouse. You can still feel how practical that logic was. The dark below fed the fighting above. Earth became supply chain. Stone became strategic resource. And the people doing the work were enslaved. Which means the map of the cave was also a map of coerced knowledge, coerced labor, and coerced endurance. Then the economy shifted, and the cave changed masks. In 1838, Stephen Bishop, an enslaved guide, began leading visitors through Mammoth Cave. He was not just walking people around. He was reading the cave. He explored farther than many of the men who claimed to own the place. He sketched routes, he named features, he extended the known passages. In a system that seemed endless, Bishop became one of the people who gave it shape. Visitors came down from the light, followed his steps, and depended on his memory to get back out. The contrast is brutal. The cave made money in 2 different ways. First, as war material, then as tourism. In both versions, the work depended on people whose names were often left at the edge of the story. Yet the cave's map kept growing because those names mattered. Stephen Bishop knew the underground better than the men publishing the brochures. Then, the cave became famous again, for a different reason, in 1925, when Floyd Collins was trapped in nearby Sand Cave. He was not inside Mammoth Cave itself, but the incident dragged the whole region into national news. Rescue crews, reporters, crowds, and cameras turned the ground into a spectacle. The story spread because the American public could not look away from a man sealed beneath the earth. The irony is sharp. A hidden world got even more attention because one entrance failed to give a man back. Mammoth Cave's deeper history is even older. The historic entrance has evidence of prehistoric human use going back 5,000 to 4,000 years ago. People were entering this underground world long before the modern cave industry, long before tourism, long before maps were treated like trophies. The opening was already part of human movement, human risk, human memory. And the cave is still alive in the scientific sense, too. The Mammoth Cave Biosphere Reserve includes 41 cave-adapted species, not a few, 41. That number matters because the cave is not an empty tube. It is an ecosystem with its own slow, blind, specialized life. Darkness here is not absence, it is habitat. The scale gets stranger the longer you stay with it. The present surveyed length is over 412 miles, but the full connected system is still not known. That means every count is provisional. The world's longest cave is not long because someone measured it once and closed the book. It is long because the book is still being written in the dark. You are standing at the historic entrance now. The air changes as you step in. The temperature drops. The sound softens. Rock closes around the light behind you. The first passage bends, then another. Then the cave starts to feel less like a place and more like a decision that has never ended. And somewhere in that branching underground, the old roles are still visible. The miner, the guide, the explorer, the trapped man, the survey team. The cave keeps absorbing them into one continuous system, one that was never only hidden. It was worked, measured, sold, and remembered. In Mammoth Cave, underground was not a secret waiting to be found. It was an empire of roots, built in the dark and still expanding. Number 9. The City of the Dead beneath the City of Emperors. Rome's most hidden neighborhoods were built for the dead. Number 9 shows how burial became a map. Mammoth Cave expands the underground from a single chamber into a living system, where labor and exploration become part of the secret. Rome takes that idea and turns it inward. Down under the roads leading out of the city, the dead are not hidden in a panic. They are organized, measured, returned to again and again. A late Roman document speaks plainly about the place. Burial outside the walls was allowed, burial inside the city was not. That single rule shaped a whole underground world. The catacombs began as cemeteries cut into soft volcanic tufa, the stone under Rome that could be carved with tools and patience. Christians used them. So did some Jews and pagans. Families came first. Communities followed. Then the spaces kept growing, because one grave was never really one grave for long. You go down a narrow stair, and the air changes. It is cool, stale, close. The galleries stretch away in straight runs, then turn, then split again. On both sides, burial niches are stacked into the walls like shelves. Bodies were placed inside and sealed, then another one, then another. The same corridor could hold generation after generation. Not one grand tomb, a reused city. By the 3rd century, this underground system was already part of Rome's hidden funerary landscape. By the 4th, some of these places had become destinations. Pilgrims came to stand near martyrs' graves, lamps were lit, prayers were said. The walls began to carry images too, and those images are revealing. Not the later, familiar scenes of crucifixion that people expect now. Instead, the art leans towards symbol and rescue. Jonah emerging from the fish, Daniel among the lions, the Good Shepherd, the Magi, stories of survival, stories of promise, stories that make sense when the room around them is full of the dead. The catacombs of Priscilla give the scale a number, about 10 kilometers of burial network, about 40,000 tombs by the 5th century. One site, and it already feels like a buried district. Now multiply that across Rome. More than 40 catacombs have been discovered around the city. The total system runs for hundreds of kilometers, not a tunnel, a buried metropolis made of grief, ritual, and reuse. And for all the modern habit of treating catacombs as secret shelters, that is not what they primarily were. They were not built as hideouts for hunted believers. They were cemeteries first. The evidence keeps pulling them back to burial, memory, and devotion. The popular story wants drama. The ground gives something quieter and stranger. People came here to place the dead where law allowed, then stayed long enough to turn the place into a map of belief. One man changed how the world saw that map. Antonio Bosio first systematically explored the catacombs in 1593 CE. He crawled through sealed passages, copied inscriptions, and tried to make sense of what had been forgotten. His work, Roma Sotterranea, was published in 1632 CE after his death. He became known as the Columbus of the Catacombs. The title fits. He did not discover a single chamber. He reopened a buried district that had been closed, lost, and half erased. Even now, the exact shape of that district is hard to fix. Some catacombs may have grown from linked Christian planning. Others look more like family burial grounds that were gradually expanded and stitched together over time. The pattern changes from site to site. The underground was never assembled all at once. It accreted, it thickened. It became a city because people kept returning to the same walls and making room for one more body. The official story of Rome is all emperors, forums, triumphs, marble, sunlight. On the ground, under the roads, another Rome was being cut into stone. Narrow, dark, reused, full of names, symbols, and bones. One city stood above the earth. Another was built beneath it. Number 8. The room that changed religions twice. Under one church lies a pagan sanctuary, and under that lies Rome itself. Number 8 is a layered trapdoor in time. Number 5. The room that changed religions twice. Start with the cut. You are standing inside a basilica in Rome, and the floor beneath you is already lying. It looks solid. It is not. Beneath the Basilica of San Clemente, the ground drops through centuries in 3 stacked levels. Church above, church below, and deeper still, a Roman house turned into a Mithraeum. A room that was not built to be holy, then became holy in a very different way, and then was buried under another faith entirely. The first layer begins in the late 1st or early 2nd century AD, when a 2-story Roman house was built in the valley between the Caelian and Esquiline hills. Not a cave, not some natural shrine hidden in rock. A house, ordinary Roman domestic architecture, sitting inside the city, with walls, rooms, and a central space that could be repurposed when the time came. By the late 2nd or early 3rd century, that central room had been converted into a Mithraeum, a private sanctuary for the cult of Mithras. The change is almost surgical. The room did not vanish. It was fitted for ritual. Long benches were built along the side walls. An altar went into a rear niche. At the back, Mithras killed the bull, frozen in relief, with cautes and cautopodes at his sides, the torchbearers marking the rise and fall of light. If you enter the room now, you can still read the logic of the space. It is narrow, controlled, meant for a small circle, not a crowd. You can imagine men sitting on those benches in the half-dark, looking toward the image at the end, the whole chamber arranged like a private passage into mystery. And then the room changes again. In the 4th century, the pagan space was abandoned and filled in as Christianity rose above it. The old chamber did not stay visible as a rival monument. It was sealed, covered, absorbed into a new order. Up top, a Christian basilica took shape. Below, the Mithraeum disappeared into the earth. The body of the building became the argument. One faith did not just replace another in memory. It built over it, weight on top of weight, floor on top of floor. That is what makes San Clemente so unnerving. It is not a ruined temple in the wilderness. It is Rome compressing itself. Domestic life first, mystery religion second, Christian basilica third. 3 different uses, 3 different worlds, 1 vertical slice. If you strip away the centuries, the site stops looking like a monument and starts looking like a record of takeover. Not a clean break, a stack, a burial, a reuse so complete that the older sacred room could survive only by going underground. For centuries, the lower layers stayed hidden from ordinary sight. Then came the 19th century and Joseph Maluli, the Dominican prior who exposed the layered site during modern excavations in the 1860s. He was not just uncovering old walls. He was peeling back a city's religious memory. What had been sealed in darkness came back as evidence. The present church was no longer alone. Beneath it were earlier lives, earlier beliefs, earlier hands. The address today places the site at Via San Giovanni in Laterano, 108, also given as Via Labicana 95. That sounds almost too neat for something this tangled. But the neatness is only on the map. On the ground, the place is a controlled descent into overlap. You move from the basilica people still use, to the buried basilica beneath it, to the Mithraeum below that. 3 stacked levels, one above the next, each one made by people who thought they were fixing the world in place. And yet the deeper you go, the more temporary every layer looks. The Mithraeum is the key to that feeling, because it is not a purpose-made cave. It is an adapted room, a retrofit of belief. That matters in the most literal way. The underground here was not waiting in nature for religion to discover it. It was manufactured from ordinary urban space. First a house, then a shrine, then a sealed relic beneath a church. The sanctity was not found. It was built, altered, and buried. That is why San Clemente hits harder than a single tomb or a single chamber ever could. It shows religious replacement as architecture. It shows memory being handled like stone. It shows that when one belief system rises, it does not always sweep the old one away. Sometimes it presses it down and keeps building. And somewhere in that pressure, the room changes meaning twice. First, it serves a Roman household. Then it serves Mithras. Then it becomes part of the silence beneath Christianity. The surface above may look settled. The layers below are still arguing. Number 7. The Baroque vault built for a relic. In 1453, the House of Savoy acquired the Shroud of Turin. That is where the story starts. Not with stone, not with fire. With a relic already heavy with meaning, and a ruling family that wanted a permanent home for it. The chapel in Turin was built to house the Shroud of Turin. The project began in 1607. At first, the plan was simple enough for a court project. Build a place worthy of the cloth, give it dignity, give it security. But Turin was not a quiet backwater, and the chapel did not rise in an empty field. It was placed inside a dense royal religious complex, wedged between the cathedral and the royal palace. That location changed everything. The lower spaces, the hidden supports, the structural depths under the chapel, they were not leftover space. They were part of the point. This was architecture that had to protect, display, and control at the same time. Then Guarino Guarini arrived in Turin in 1666, and the whole thing changed character. Guarini was not just finishing a chapel, he was turning it into a machine of stone and light. The chapel was completed under his direction in 1683, and if you stand inside that story, you can feel the ambition in the numbers alone. Decades of work, one relic at the center, one building shaped to make the relic feel both unreachable and gloriously present. Guarini's most famous move was the dome. He designed it as a layered, light-driven structure, almost like a reliquary tower above the altar. The geometry climbs, it repeats, it opens upward in a way that looks impossible until you remember that every line was calculated to guide the eye, and every opening was meant to let light behave like theology. You do not just enter this chapel, you are directed by it, and the relic itself kept moving through that system. In 1694, the shroud was moved to the great central altar designed by Antonio Bertola. That altar gave the cloth its ceremonial center. It also made the hidden engineering below even more important, because a building that performs holiness in public still has to survive in private. Weight presses down, stone answers, the unseen parts do their job. For centuries, that balance held. Then came the night of April 11th, 1997. Fire tore through the chapel. Heat cracked the structure. Smoke filled the royal complex. The relic had already been moved out in 1993 during restoration, which spared it from the blaze, but the building itself was badly damaged. What had taken generations to construct could be undone in hours. The chapel that once seemed made for permanence suddenly looked fragile in the most brutal way. The restoration lasted years, carefully, slowly, piece by piece. When the chapel reopened to the public on September 27, 2018, it came back as both monument and recovery, not just a Baroque triumph anymore, also a survivor. That is the hard fact at the center of it. This was never just a decorative room for a famous cloth. It was a structure designed to protect a relic, frame power, and hide the load-bearing work underneath all the glory. The cloth was the reason. The engineering was the answer. The underground spaces, the hidden supports, the dense royal setting between cathedral and palace, they were part of the same logic from the beginning. A relic can be displayed on an altar. First, someone has to build the world that can hold it. Number 6. The holy place three religions cannot split. This underground shrine is fought over because everyone can claim it, and nobody can truly share it. Number 6 raises the stakes. But the Holy Shroud chamber showed one answer to the underground problem. Seal it, guard it, turn stone into a vessel. In Hebron, that answer fails. Picture the old city at dusk. The streets narrow, the walls close in. Under one massive enclosure sits a cave that Jews, Christians, and Muslims all call holy. The same place, the same buried depth, three different claims. A rabbi might speak of Abraham and Sarah. A Christian pilgrim might come looking for the patriarchs of Scripture. A Muslim worshipper calls it the Ibrahimi Mosque, tied to Ibrahim and the sacred line that follows him. UNESCO describes the whole thing as a 1st century AD architectural complex around the traditional burial site of Abraham and his family. The cave is old. The enclosure is older than most nations. Worship never really stopped. It stretches from the early Roman period to today. That continuity sounds peaceful. It is not. It is pressure. This is not memory shared in theory. It is memory squeezed into a space that is physically divided and tightly controlled. One holy site, different entrances, different prayer spaces, different rules, different hours. The underground chamber remains the center, but the living world above it is split into pieces. The stone does not care who is right. People do. On February 25, 1994, that pressure burst. Baruch Goldstein was an American-Israeli settler and physician. He entered the compound during prayer and opened fire on Muslim worshippers inside. In seconds, the sacred place became a crime scene. Around 30 Muslim worshippers were killed there that day. The killings did not come out of nowhere. They came from a site already loaded with rivalry, grievance, and fear. After that morning, everything hardened. Security tightened. Access changed. Prayer space changed. Movement changed. The site no longer felt like a shared, sacred chamber. It felt like a fortress built over an argument that would not end. The violence did not create the conflict. It exposed its shape. The center of the site is not only the cave itself, it is the monumental shell around it. UNESCO's language matters here. A monumental enclosure, a sacred cave inside it. The underground secret is not hidden by nature alone. It is framed, protected, and politically fixed by architecture. The building is not just covering the burial tradition. It is making the burial tradition durable enough to fight over for generations. You can see why no one gives it up. If the cave is Abraham's resting place, then the claim reaches back to the roots of faith itself. If it is holy to all 3 monotheistic religions, then every community sees itself not as a guest, but as an heir. Heirs do not like to be told to wait outside. So the place becomes a puzzle with no clean solution. One tradition says the dead are here. Another says the dead are here too. The third says the same. Under the stone, the chambers are sealed. Above ground, the arguments are wide open. There is still a question nobody can settle by prayer alone. What exactly lies in those sealed cave chambers beneath the monument, and how much of the traditional burial claim can be verified archaeologically? The holiness is unquestioned. The contents are not. In Hebron, underground is not a refuge from history. It is where history is trapped. Officially, the site is a shared, sacred enclosure watched over, managed, and defended. On the ground, one doorway, one corridor, one prayer line can become a boundary no one trusts. Number 5. The fortress with a city under its feet. If your home could sink 85 meters into the earth, would you still call it a town? In Cappadocia, near modern Derinkuyu in Nevşehir province, that question stops being a thought experiment. It becomes architecture. The ground there is soft, volcanic tuff, the kind of rock you can carve if you have patience, labor, and a very serious reason to disappear. Someone did exactly that. They cut a city downward. At the surface, Derinkuyu looks almost ordinary, a town, low buildings, dry air, nothing that warns you what is underneath. Then the shaft begins, then the rooms, then the sense that the earth has been turned inside out. The modern museum description says the complex may reach about 85 meters deep. That is not a cellar. That is not a basement with ambitions. That is a buried world. It was not built for comfort. It was built for pressure, for raids, for the moment when the people above ground had to become people below it. UNESCO places Derinkuyu inside a wider Cappadocian cave landscape shaped by erosion. But erosion did not make the city. People did. Over time, across generations, they turned a natural landscape into a defensive machine. The first thing that matters is what they put nearest the top. Stables, not homes, not churches, stables. That detail says everything. You do not drag animals deep underground if you can avoid it. So the city was organized like a working system, not a fantasy hideout. Logistics first, survival second, comfort never. From there, the city layers down into cellars, dining halls, churches, a missionary school, and a vertical ventilation shaft that also served as a well. That last part is the strange, elegant brutality of the place. Air and water, breath and survival. The same shaft that carried one necessity down into the rock also kept the other one available. No extra space, no wasted motion. In Derinkuyu, infrastructure had to do double duty, or it did not belong there. The numbers make the thing feel almost unreal. 85 meters deep, one ventilation shaft about 55 meters down. Only about 10% of the site visitable today. That means the part people see is just a small opening into a much larger buried plan. The rest stays dark, sealed, and partially unknown. You are not looking at a tourist attraction first. You are looking at an old response to fear, made permanent in rock. And fear was not abstract. UNESCO links the broader development of these subterranean towns to refuge from raids, especially in the Byzantine period, when communities faced Arab invasions. That is the context. Not legend, not mystery. Pressure from above. The people underground were not hiding because they loved secrecy. They were hiding because they wanted to keep their families alive. Inside, the defense was simple and ruthless. Massive stone doors could seal passages. Food could be stored. Water could be held in reserve. The city could shut itself off and wait. From outside, the entrances became dead ends. From inside, they became a plan. That is the whole logic of Derinkuyu. Turn depth into delay. Turn delay into survival. The city was open to the public in 1965. By then, only a fraction could be shown safely. Even now, the official numbers do not settle everything. Some secondary sources talk about 18 levels, but the exact full extent is still not something you can stand under and count cleanly. What is clear is bigger than the map. Estimates place 150 to 200 underground settlements across Cappadocia. Derinkuyu was not a one-off miracle. It was part of a regional habit of living with the threat of being forced to vanish. That makes the place feel less like a curiosity and more like a buried record of routine emergency. Whole communities learning how to descend. Whole families knowing where to sleep, where to store grain, where to bring animals, where to close the stone and wait. You can still feel that in the empty corridors today. The air narrows. The walls press in. The steps keep dropping. Then the silence changes. It is not the silence of a cave. It is the silence of a fortress after the people have left. The doors are no longer being rolled into place. The halls are empty. The wells are still there. The shafts still climb into the dark. But the city no longer breathes. It was opened in 1965, yet most of it remains out of reach. Not because it vanished, because it was never meant to be fully seen. Derinkuyu survives as a place built to outlast danger and then outlast the people who built it. A town buried so deep that even its defenses became part of the landscape. Number 4. The grave that had to stay invisible. On the steppe, some tombs were designed to vanish completely. In northern and central Mongolia, that was not a metaphor. It was a plan. Start with the numbers. In 2011, archaeologists in Bulgan province found Ulan Kermin Sharun Bumbagar. The tomb was hidden under the steppe, as if the ground itself had closed over it. The descent ran 42 meters, then it kept going. About 7 meters below the surface, the passage ended at a mausoleum cut into the earth and sealed away from view. That is a long way to hide a burial. Most Mongolian graves do not work like that. Many are marked on the surface with stone, or left as visible traces in a huge pastoral landscape where the land can look empty for miles and still be full of history. But this one was built to disappear. A hidden corridor, a deep drop, a royal burial made not for display, but for concealment. The tomb dates to the last quarter of the 7th century. That places the burial in a period when status was being argued over in earth and stone. Not every elite grave was buried the same way. Some stood on the surface, declared by monuments and markers. Others were pushed down into the ground, where only those who already knew the place could ever hope to find them. Ulangkarmin Shurun Bumbagar is one of the clearest examples of that choice. The choice was expensive. A 42-meter slope is not an accident. It takes labor. It takes planning. It takes enough authority to command people to dig a tunnel into the steppe for a person who must then be protected by darkness. The tomb was not hidden because it was small. It was hidden because it was important. In Mongolia, deep burial was not the default. It was the exception. Around it sits a much larger buried record. Elite graves, looted cemeteries, chambers disturbed by robbing, heavy machinery, and the simple difficulty of finding what the landscape tries to erase. On the steppe, archaeology often begins with absence. A flat patch of earth, a slight rise, a scatter of stones. Then, one excavation opens, and suddenly there is depth where nothing seemed to be. The comparison reaches back much farther than the 7th century. The Xiongnu Cemetery at Tamir, dated to 100 BC to AD 100, shows that burial organization and status were already being worked out across Mongolia, long before the royal tomb at Bulgan province was built. Different eras, different powers, same problem. How do you bury rank in a place where the surface gives so little away? The answer, at least sometimes, was to make the grave invisible. Invisibility was useful. If a tomb cannot be seen, it is harder to target, harder to rob, harder to turn into a public statement by someone else. That does not make it safe forever. It only changes the odds. Many Mongolian burials were still disturbed later, because the steppe is open, and what is hidden under grass can still be cut into by a blade, a shovel, or a machine. But the logic is clear. Hide the body, hide the route, hide the chamber. Make the earth itself do part of the guarding. You can picture the tomb as a sealed descent, not a monument rising above the land, but a corridor sinking into it. The entrance would have looked ordinary once the surface was closed again. Maybe that was the point. No facade to admire, no doorway announcing what lay below, just the steppe above, and a royal burial under it. That is what makes the 2011 discovery so important. It was not just another grave. It was a rare, intact example of engineered concealment on a landscape where most burials are at least partly visible, at least partly marked, at least partly claimed by the surface. Here, the claim was different. Stay down, stay hidden, do not become a landmark. The result is a kind of forensic map made from holes in the ground. One tomb, one passage, one depth measurement. Then a wider pattern begins to emerge. Underground burial in Mongolia was not random. It was selective. It was political. It appears where the people burying their dead wanted control over access, over memory, over who could know where the center really was. The Bulgan tomb feels stark. It does not shout. It withdraws. The numbers say everything. 2011, 42 meters, 7 meters down, late 7th century. Each one is a measure of concealment. Each one says the same thing in a different way. Someone built a royal grave that had to stay invisible. At the site itself, the final image is almost quiet, a long cut in the earth, a descending line into darkness. The steppe above it stretches flat and open, as if nothing had ever been there. And below that calm surface, the tomb waits in silence, hidden so thoroughly that the landscape seems to have swallowed its own secret. Number 3. The city that sank but did not disappear. A lost port city found at the bottom of a bay. Number 3 is what happens when the ground itself fails. Mongolia shows that absence itself can be engineered, because the less a tomb is seen, the less it can be stolen. Heracleion is the opposite kind of disappearance. It was not hidden on purpose. It was swallowed in plain sight. For centuries, the city existed as a name in old texts. Herodotus wrote about Egypt. Strabo wrote about Egypt. Somewhere in those pages was a port city called Heracleion, and another name, Thonis, that scholars kept trying to separate from it. 2 cities, maybe. 1 city, maybe not. The paper record stayed slippery for a long time. The seabed did not care. In 1992, Franck Godillot and the IEASM team began surveying Abukir Bay off Egypt's coast. They were not looking for a legend. They were looking for traces of ancient harbors. In 2000, after years of underwater work, the ghost city started to resolve out of the mud, not as a story, as stone, as bronze, as weight. The first thing that matters is scale. This was not a little shrine that drifted off into the sea. It was a major harbor city at the mouth of a Nile branch. Some reports place it about 7 kilometers offshore, under roughly 6 meters of water. The site held temples, statues, shipwrecks, and ritual deposits. More than 100 shipwrecks were eventually linked to the wider excavation area. That is not the footprint of a rumor. That is a working port gone still. And the city did not just sit there like a clean snapshot. It was layered. Trade sat beside ritual. Harbor logistics sat beside religion. People call it an Egyptian Atlantis, but the fit is poor. Atlantis is a fantasy of total loss. Heracleion is messier, harder, realer. It was a city where merchants, priests, and sailors all left material behind. Anchors, cargo, offerings, monuments. The place was built to move goods and honor gods at the same time. The statues tell one side of the story. The waterlogged temple remains tell another. Colossal figures emerged from the silt. Temple architecture emerged with them. These were not random objects washed in from elsewhere. They belonged to a monumental religious center that had once dominated the harbor landscape. The city had been a place where belief and business shared the same ground. Then the ground stopped behaving. Heracleion did not simply vanish in one dramatic night. The delta was changing under it. The land was sinking. Water was advancing. Earthquakes and subsidence likely played their part. The Nile branch that fed the port shifted. The shoreline moved. The harbor changed shape, then changed again. Over time, the city slipped below the surface while still remaining, for a while, economically alive in memory and text. You can think of it as a slow failure of the floor. Not a collapse you hear once, a collapse you keep living on. That is why the rediscovery mattered so much. It collapsed a scholarly confusion that had lasted for generations. Thonis and Heracleion were treated as separate places in the literature. The underwater finds helped show they were one site, one port, one city with two names attached to different traditions. The water did not erase the identity. It split the evidence until modern archaeology stitched it back together. The team kept finding pieces that fit the same world. Harbor remains, temple remains, ritual deposits, shipwrecks clustered around the site like debris from a life interrupted, not erased. Even now, Gaudio has estimated that only about 5% of the site had been revealed in one public report, so what has surfaced is already overwhelming. What remains below is still larger. The city's final destruction is still debated. A single, catastrophic event, repeated earthquakes and subsidence, a slower collapse of the Nile Delta ground combined with flooding. The evidence points to a long unraveling, then a final disappearance by the end of the 8th century AD. The exact last blow is still hidden in the sediment. That is the strange power of Heracleion. It was not buried to be protected. It was not buried to be worshipped. It was buried because the landscape itself turned against it. When it was finally found, the discovery did not just recover a city. It recovered the moment a port, a temple center, and a whole coastal world slid under the bay and stayed there. Number 2. The army that was never meant to see daylight. Thousands of soldiers, horses, and weapons waited in silence for 2,000 years. Number 2 is the Emperor's Shadow. On March 29, 1974, in Xiyang village near Lintong, Shaanxi province, a handful of farmers were digging a well for water. The ground was hard. The spring had been dry. They kept cutting into the soil, expecting mud, maybe a trickle, maybe nothing at all. Instead, the blades struck fired clay, then bronze, then more broken fragments. The first thing to come up was a human head. Not a real one, a clay one, buried face down in the dirt for more than 2,000 years. That kind of discovery does not announce itself like a legend. It looks like a mistake at first, a broken head, a few arrowheads, a strange piece of armor. Only later do people realize that the mistake is the story. The site was part of the Mausoleum complex of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor to unite China. He died around 210 BCE, And what lay under the fields near Xi'an was not a single grave in the simple sense. It was an imperial landscape, a buried state, the outer edge of a system meant to survive death by keeping power in formation. Formation is the key. As excavation expanded in 1974, the ground opened onto ranks of life-sized clay soldiers, horses, chariots, and weapons, not scattered, arranged, shoulders squared, lines kept, units facing outward as if the enemy might still come over the horizon. There were thousands of figures, each one slightly different, each one locked into the same military purpose. You can stand in front of those pits today and feel the scale of the thing without needing any explanation. The soldiers do not just fill space, they occupy it with discipline. Their silence is not empty, it is ordered. That is what makes the Terracotta Army so unsettling. It was never meant to be found by daylight. It was meant to remain inside the earth, in the dark, while the emperor rested somewhere deeper in the same complex. The army is not the tomb chamber itself. It is the outer military zone, the visible edge of a much larger, hidden world. That world is enormous. UNESCO protects a property area of 56.25 square kilometers here, with nearly 200 accompanying pits spread across the mausoleum landscape. The famous warrior pits are only the part the public knows. The rest is still folded into the ground. Storage pits, ritual spaces, auxiliary burials, more of the buried court, more of the buried machine, still waiting. The farmers who found it were not searching for history. They were trying to find water. Dry soil pushed a village into action, and a hidden imperial world answered back with clay heads and bronze points. The first archaeologists who arrived did not walk into a finished revelation. They walked into fragments, broken surfaces, partial forms, a soldier's neck, a horse's leg, an arrowhead still cold from the earth. The full army emerged, piece by piece, and with every trench, the buried formation became more legible. This was not decoration. It was a defensive afterlife installation, a force built to guard a dead ruler, as if the boundary between rule and death had never existed. Think about the emperor at the center of it, Qin Shi Huang, the first man to unite China under one authority, a ruler who wanted scale, order, and permanence, a ruler who understood that empire does not end cleanly just because the body does. So he built underground what above-ground power always wants: continuity. The army kept that illusion alive for more than 2,000 years, not because anyone could see it, because nobody could. The soil held, the chambers sealed, the figures stood in their ranks while dynasties rose and fell, while names changed, while roads shifted, while the city above them breathed and forgot. Then, in one drought-struck field in 1974, the silence broke. And when it did, it was not the emperor's chamber that came first. It was the shadow around it, the outer guard. The line of men who never saw the sun. They were uncovered by accident, but they had been waiting for exactly this kind of interruption. The ground gave way, and the buried army began to return to the world that had lost it. Even now, the central tomb chamber remains sealed. The army is visible, the chamber is not. So the story stops at the edge of the most famous hidden room in China and refuses to go farther. The outer pits have already shown what one emperor wanted in death: scale, obedience, permanence. The inner chamber still keeps its own answer. The ground at Lintong opened just enough to reveal the guard line. Then it stopped. A buried empire still stands in the dark, and its deepest center is still untouched. Number 1. The sealed center of empire. The most famous buried emperor on Earth still hasn't given up all his secrets. Number 1 is the one no one dares open. Qin Shi Huang is sealed at the northern foot of Mount Li, about 35 kilometers northeast of Xi'an. The first emperor to unite China ordered the complex built in 246 BCE, and the work did not stop until his death in 210 BCE. That is a long time to dig for one dead ruler. Long enough to turn labor into geometry. Long enough to make a burial look like a state project. UNESCO describes workers from across the empire building a vast underground city inside a gigantic mound, and that is exactly what it feels like when you stand at the edge of it. Not a grave in the ordinary sense, a model of power, made below ground. The scale is hard to hold in one glance. The property covers 56.25 square kilometers. Nearly 200 accompanying pits sit around the tomb. More than 600 sites, from burial tombs to architectural remains, belong to the same landscape. The surviving mound still rises 51.3 meters above the plain. It has been there so long that the shape itself feels official, like land that has learned to obey. And the layout is not random. UNESCO says the complex mirrors the capital of Xianyang. The emperor did not just want a tomb. He wanted a miniature political map, a dead center with provinces around it, an afterlife organized like a dynasty. The army faces outward too, built to guard against enemies from every direction. Even in death, the first emperor was thinking defensively. That is what makes the site so strange. The outside has been opened in pieces, the inside has not. In 1974, local farmers digging a well struck the Terracotta Army near the tomb mound, and the world suddenly saw one layer of the system. Clay soldiers, horses, bronze chariots, weapons, ranks of figures standing as if they still expected orders. The discovery made the mausoleum famous everywhere, but it also exposed the limit of what could be seen. Because the central burial chamber has never been opened, that fact does most of the work, not the rumors. Not the legend of treasure, the chamber itself, a sealed interior at the center of one of the most studied burial landscapes on Earth. Sima Qian, writing long after Qin Shi Huang's death, described a hidden underworld beneath the mound. He wrote of rivers and streams of mercury, of a sky made from jewels, of traps for anyone who tried to enter. Ancient text, yes. Modern surveys keep feeding it. Abnormal mercury in the soil has been detected around the site, and the rumor survives because the ground keeps offering it new oxygen. Still, the chamber remains sealed. Scientists have looked from above, around, and through the margins. Archaeologists have mapped the outer fields, and the pits, and the surrounding remains. The center stays shut. That is not hesitation. It is a decision. The mound has never been fully opened, because opening it means risking what time has preserved. The emperor's chamber is not just under the earth. It is protected by the fact that nobody has yet forced the final door. Think about what was built here. A ruler dies in 210 BCE. The empire does not bury him in a simple pit. It builds a world around him. It gives him guards, horses, chariots, a capital in miniature. It gives him distance, and then more distance. The visible army is already impressive enough to fill museums and documentaries and the imagination of anyone standing in Lintong. But it is still only the outer ring. The actual center remains where it was always meant to be, hidden, preserved, and inaccessible. That is the part that changes the feeling of the whole place. The Terracotta Army is not the secret. It is the announcement that a secret exists. It is the perimeter. The sealed chamber is the message inside the envelope, and nobody has broken the seal. You can almost feel the discipline in that design. The emperor's world was meant to continue after his body failed, but only on his terms. The outer pits show the public face of that wish. The center keeps the private one. The mausoleum lives in two states at once. It is excavated and untouched, known and unknown, verified by archaeology, but still guarded by soil. That is why the place never stops pulling people back. Not because it has one dramatic reveal waiting at the end, because the deepest reveal is still withheld. The buried city has opened enough to prove itself real. It has not opened enough to finish the story. That is the sealed center of empire, a dead emperor, still defended by the ground, a tomb complex that became a map of power before it became a monument, a chamber no one dares disturb. The army stands in daylight now. The heart of the tomb still does not.